We're back. This is Dear Woke Christian, the podcast, and my name is Jason. Thank you so very much for stopping by today. I really appreciate it. We're going to look at a author, writer who has been writing quite a bit about the difference between being woke and being awake. Pretty interesting topic. But before we jump into that, I want to thank you all very much for your support of dearwokechristian.com. The views on that blog have shot up significantly. And I just want to thank every last one of you for checking it out, for subscribing, for commenting, so on and so forth. You all make all of this stuff worth it and useful. And I just want to thank you again from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much for checking out dearwokechristian.com. Don't stop though. Keep going there, checking it out. So let's go today because we do have a long video. So let's just jump in and let's meet Noelle Marin. And let's see what she has to say. She has some interesting things. I will be stopping along the way just to add commentary to what she's saying. Let's go.
To be woke is to be alert and attuned to the layers of oppression in society, generally surrounding the issues of race, sex, gender. It has a long history, although I think a lot of us think.
And I'll stop right there. I agree. I think the term woke initially in this classical sense was just being aware of what's going on in the world. And of course, oppression became part of the narrative as well. I have no problem with that. I think that's a very keen observation. And I think she continues on with that from there.
Think of it as being a fairly new movement. The name is new, but it really is a reformulation of old ideas and old roads that various countries have gone down. And I think it's ostensibly a movement for justice. But when you really understand what the internal logic of the movement, it fundamentally is something that weakens people far more than it helps, and particularly the people it claims to want to help. So this is why I find it to be alarming. I think it's more than just a political movement. It's actually a spiritual movement before anything else.
And before she goes and talks about the history of it, I want you to think about that. She kind of showed her hand. She said that different societies and cultures and nations have gone down this path before. This is not new. And she's going to explain it a little bit later. And I want you to keep that in mind. Like, this isn't new. This isn't the first time now is new to us. And it's definitely grandiose and it's bombastic in our current context, but it's not new. It's not new. It's something that's been going on in human society, in human culture before. I just want us to think about that. Let's listen to what she has to say about the history of this movement.
So the history of the movement is really important to understand. I think you can pinpoint it in a garden with a snake cajoling the first woman to be you can be as gods. But I think that if we want to specifically plant it, a starting point in more modern times, most people point to Karl Marx, but I think it's important also to understand what Marx was influenced by.
I do want to stop there before she goes, because she's going to give an excellent description of how we got to this current state that we're in. But I do think we can't look over what she alluded to. Genesis 3, the snake in the garden. That was probably, of course, it's the genesis of sin. We know that. But I think we could also make a fair argument that this is the birth of Gnosticism. This is the birth of progressivism. All of those different things come from those questions the dialogue between the snake and Eve. And there's a lot of things that come from that we're dealing with today. So the idea of wokeism, I think we shouldn't just look past that. There's a lot of good meat on that bone.
And this is a philosopher named Hegel. And Hegel's really important to understand because he started really the engine of the modern progressive movement, which he called the dialectic. And without getting too esoteric, the dialectic was just this idea that history is a movement of progression towards a utopian end. And that progression, that progress through history comes through the engine of revolution, which is built around an idea manifesting itself in the state of nature, in the political state in particular. And that's it. That will have contradictions. Those contradictions have to be worked out and worked through. And then you get a new state. And then that state has its own contradictions. You keep cycling and synthesizing in the progress of history until you reach that utopia. So Marx was really captivated by this new thing in philosophy called the dialectic.
So I totally understand that. I totally get what she's saying. And the only pushback I would have is that this is again, an idea and a notion that man can do without God. And man, if we could only push back on this notion, if we could only fight back, if we only had the courage, the bravery, and the boldness to say no and push back against this, I believe we would see significant improvements in this regard. And what I mean by not just saying no, just to say no, but no and point people to a biblical, scriptural solution to issues, problems that they might actually see, that might actually be there. And it would be so wonderful if we could get some gusto about us and say, no, we're not going to go down this path of clownery and foolishness, but rather we're going to deal with this in a biblical Christian manner. Man, I think we would see so much more success.
But he was a strict materialist, whereas Hegel was thinking of this as a rational movement. He really said, no, there is nothing beyond the material. The material world is all that is. And so there is this dialectic.
The material world is all that is. So that's a Karl Marx idea. And keep in mind, Marx was an atheist. Marx did not believe in God. And that's proven in his writing, in his teachings as it relates to the material world. Like, this is all that is. This physical world is all that is. That's something that's problematic, of course.
This engine throughout time, reaching a utopia, but it's a utopia built purely on economic terms, with every person being defined into division as either an oppressor or an oppressed, working class, proletariat, or ruling class. And
just think about that. Like, especially if you feel like, Jason, your stance against critical race theory, social justice, Black Lives Matters, wokeism is too robust. You're pushing too much. Am I really? Like, literally, she said that society is broken into oppressed and oppressors, the ruling class and those that are being ruled. What do we have here? What are we talking about in the modern parlance? What are we talking about? Somebody versus another group. This group that has power, this group that doesn't have power, this group that's oppressing, this group that's being oppressed. That's all we have. This is the Marx again, and she's going to talk about it later on. Like, it's just woven into our societies now that we don't even recognize that we are playing a game that nobody wins.
And that this is where the revolution would happen, and that the revolution was inevitable. So that's sort of the intellectual foundation. Into this came postmodernism, which basically identified language as being avenues for power, and then therefore we have to be able to manipulate words. And in manipulating our language, we can manipulate the interior life of a community.
Manipulate language. Just think about that. In 2022, how much have we started to play with language? And it's been going on for quite some time, but I think we've really gotten efficient at playing with language in 2020, and I'll say definitely all the way up to the modern day. Like, even something simple as something that was cut and dry, male and female. I mean, that's up to debate now. Like, there's arguments, discussions, and dialogues had about what is a man, what is a woman. That's crazy. That's insane. And she's going to talk more about language. And I think that's something I would love to hear her discuss a little bit more, actually, how language is being used to further this dialogue and this discussion. How one side uses words, but they don't mean them the way that the other side does, or they don't use them in the classical sense. They use them in this new modern format. So just something to think about.
Because once we no longer can communicate clearly and understand that our words are connected to reality, then they become tools that we can wound each other with, or that we can just destabilize our community with. And then intersection. Destabilize
a community. Boy, think about how our words now, and the words that we use, that words that we used to use without any problem before, now are deemed problematic or racist or troubling or anything triggering, anything like that. Like, wow, words now are causing more problem than fists ever could, than bullets ever could. Is that not destabilizing our society with something as simple as words?
Functionality came and further centered the oppressive identity. And this is when we really had the birth of identity politics, was late 80s, early 90s. and it really crystallized something in the movement. The presuppositions are all built on Hegel, Marx, Freudianism, and the Frankfurt School. And this is what we see now. This is the march through history, the progression into future utopia that is constantly supposed to be working itself out in time, with rejection of everything that came before it, is the culmination of all of those presuppositions.
The rejection of everything that came before it. The rejection of everything that came before it. How is that being played out today? How are we rejecting the past? I mean, if nothing else, we don't even know. We're not even learning from our past. We have no appreciation for our past. We're treating everything in the past as bad. Everything in the past is racist. Everything in the past is problematic. So therefore, we just start from today, and we don't even know how we got here today. Very troubling.
Into now. Marx said this too, that the greatest obstacles to revolution are two things: the faith and the family. Why?
I think she really should have. And I know in some of her other lectures, she's gone into a little bit deeper. I really wish she could have explained this more in this regard. I'll dig in.
I think because the faith gives people a context for their suffering, rather than marinate in the inequality or the cross of our life. We're actually told to embrace that cross, that we can find real meaning and real nobility in suffering well our circumstances. But no revolution is born out of people suffering well their circumstances. A revolution is born out of people who are enraged by their circumstances and feel inadequate and helpless to transcend them.
I do want to point that out because lots of people like to say that Jesus Christ was a social justice warrior. Christ would have supported this social justice movement. And I argue all the time that there's no evidence to that point at all. And matter of fact, he didn't, because he did not, again, unseat Rome. He did not change the political climate of Jerusalem during his day. None of those things happened. None of it. It didn't happen. So the reason I bring that up is because notice that she said that the faith helps you to suffer well and to suffer nobly, if you will. And that's what Christ told us to do. That's what our Lord told us to do, is to suffer well, is to be noble, is to carry our cross, embrace our cross, and recognize that he is our final reward. He is our great treasure. And if you get rid of that faith, if you unseat that faith, and it's now living my best life or getting whatever I can out of a situation or getting the most out of my modern day situation, where are you going to end up? Where will you end up? You will not end up in a place where you're able to suffer well when you actually are required or needed to suffer well. Just something. And of course, she's going to talk, she doesn't talk about family, but I think that family, the nuclear family, the husband and wife, 2 and 3 kids, 4 kids, dog, all that kind of good jazz. The family is the primary means by which discipleship happens. So that whole passing down of the faith comes through a family. And just look at a modern situation. How are we at war with the family? Every day you see it. And the same thing with the faith. You see a war against the Christian faith. And I think that that's something we should be mindful of. We shouldn't just say, oh, it's just going on. Everything's going along to get along. No, there's a real problem. There's a real fight. There's a real battle that we need to be mindful of.
So once you are weakened to that point where you feel that you have no power, no possibility, then the only answer left logically is to fight the system, destroy the system, run it to the ground, and hope that some new utopia will come from that. I think the average student at a college, university, or even, your nice woke Aunt Susan or your neighbor down the street, they are not steeped in Hegel. They don't consider themselves Marxists. And this is part of where the confusion lies, is that it's ostensibly a movement just for justice. And who doesn't want justice? It's a movement that wants to fight racism. Every good-willed, normal, reasonable person wants to fight racism.
Absolutely.
So there are all of these very, deeply actually Christian claims. Christians are supposed to be people of justice, supposed to be people who are fighting against injustice. And I think
I do want to point that out. We should be fighting against injustice in the context that we are preaching the gospel. We shouldn't just be fighting against injustice to be fighting against injustice. We still have to bring the gospel to bear. There's still a level now we can say, hey, I've preached the gospel. Now let me go dig this well. I've preached the gospel. Let me go help at this crisis pregnancy center. Totally get that. Totally get that. A lot of the time, though, we see people saying, well, I'm going to go dig a well. I'm going to go work at a crisis pregnancy center and not give the gospel. And I think that's where we've gotten it confused and got messed up, because we've not made the main thing, which is sharing the gospel with those who don't know it. So, and even those that do, they still need to hear the gospel. Absolutely.
I think that the reality that most people would consider themselves Marxists, but have adopted so many of the conclusions of this movement, is just a sign of how pervasive and how ubiquitous the movement has become. It's the water in which we swim. It's the air that we
Here we
breathe.
go.
It's in our movies. It's in our stories. It's in the way we frame narratives. It's in media. It's in politics. It's in the academy, rampantly so.
Right.
And so all of these things coalesce to create a default way of thinking, a filter upon which we see the world without even realizing that we're necessarily looking through a filter at all. In some ways, it's sort of spin off the old C.S. Lewis book, The Screw Tape Letters, where he had that famous line that the greatest power of the devil is that he can convince you he doesn't exist.
And I don't want to get too far. So I want you to think about, like, how are we steeped in and literally caged in by critical race theory, woke politics, and woke ideologies, literally in everything that we do, from the coffee that you buy in the morning to the gas that you buy to your interactions with your coworkers, your neighbors, and food that you eat. I mean, all of it somehow or another is now impacted by race. And she's going to tell some good stories later on, I think would really help cement this argument that we have to push back on this insanity, so that lest we lose control of a situation and no longer recognize even the world that we're living in.
And therefore you're at his mercy and beholden to his power in a way that you might not have been, should you be able to identify what was happening. And I think in some ways the woke movement is similar to that with regard to its presuppositions, that the greatest power this filter of ideological filter has over us is that we don't realize that we're looking through a filter at all. And we just think that this is the way that you see reality. So there are certain ways which I think that we can say that most of the people we know who are being caught up in this movement, including, a lot of Christians, I talked to a lot of Catholics and Christians who feel that, well, Christ would have fought side by side with people for racial justice.
Would he really?
He would have fought against, lecherous men and for women who want to be,
I think that's something it's easy to say Christ would have, as if there weren't situations that were very similar to this in his day, as if, like, well, this is something brand new. Well, Christ would have drove a Maserati. Well, there was no significant vehicle comparison back in the early Bible times. However, there were injustices all the time. And we know that he did not deal with those like we think that he would. And I think that's where we should become students of the scriptures and realize and recognize that Christ did not deal, because his focus was always on his main goal, which was to honor the Father and, of course, provide a means of salvation for us. So I think we should always be mindful of that and not allow that to get lost in the haze at all.
to feel that they have true dignity and aren't instruments of someone else's pleasure. Absolutely. There's nothing those are true Christian precepts, and Christ would have certainly been on the side of justice in those matters. The thing that ideology does is it's really a true to form ideology, in that it takes partial truths and totalizes them. And in that totalization, it presents something that is a lie, fundamentally, because it creates the only way to look at the world is through this lens of power and domination. And what it does is it fundamentally defines a human person differently than what the Christian vision of what a human person is.
That's something I think we really have to take the time and pay attention. Are we redefining terms, whether they're biblical terms or whatnot? Are we redefining them carelessly, recklessly, or to our own advantage? Because there's only one advantage to redefining humans, and that is nefarious. But let us continue.
The Christian vision of the human person is that we're defined on universals. We're rational animals, to use just based on Aristotelian logic. But also through special revelation, we know that we are called to be sons and daughters of a loving Father, that we are defined in relationship to God. We're defined by love itself, love Himself. The woke define a person very differently and incompatibly. So for the woke, the person is not defined by the love of God, but by the hatred of man or hatred of society. In our very definition is where we sit on the line of the evil of society. So for example, to be a woman is not just to, be a woman in any sort of traditional sense, that there's a bodily meaning there and there's some certain spiritual symbolism. But to be a woman for the woke is to be fundamentally fighting the oppression that's at the core of your being. For example, in 2017, there was the first Women's March, and there was a group of pro-life feminists who were co-sponsoring the march. And when the organizers got wind that they were pro-life, they said, "Oh, well, you can march with us, but you cannot have any official affiliation with us." And they were confused. They said, "But we support, the dignity of women. We want to fight for similar goals. We overlap in certain areas." And this is not just a pro-abortion march; it's a pro-women's march. But the thing I think we have to understand about the ideology is that it's not about supporting the person in the oppressed group. It's about supporting the person in the oppressed group who supports the ideology. So it's really empowering the ideology, not.
And that's something I think really needs to be dug into. Like, am I supporting a biblical truth, or am I supporting an ideology, or an ideology rather? What am I supporting? Am I supporting what God has said, or am I supporting what man is saying, or what society is saying now? Because again, society has changed literally in the last 3 years, we now no longer know what male and female is. That's insane. So I think that's a good question that we should ask. Like, am I supporting a biblical truth, or am I supporting a God honoring truth, or am I supporting what society is saying?
Empowering human being. So it's not enough to be a woman. You have to be an ideological woman. You have to be a politicized woman. We hear the same thing echoed with Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author of the 1619 Project, who famously said, "We all know there's a difference between being racially Black and being politically Black, that it's simply not enough to be a Black person. You have to be supporting our agenda."
Well, first of all, we already know that she said racially Black. What does that even mean? Like, what is racially Black? Because as I argue, there's no such thing as races. So, but even more than that, what does that mean? Where does that come from? Where do we get the idea and the notion that you can be ethnically Black, but not racially Black, or you can be racially Black, but not ideologically Black? I don't even understand what that means. What does it mean to be Black? Is a great question, but this is a postmodern. That's a postmodern commentary.
In order to be considered. So they don't actually it's not actually about diversity, it's about uniformity of thought, but with different people, representatives of different groups, embracing and affirming that uniformity of thought. So one important thing that I think we need to pay attention to is the way in which words can sound innocuous to our ears, because I think most people translate them into being something reasonable. But for the movement, it's far more radical than I think what we think initially. And a good example of that is the word equity. Equity sounds like something good. It sounds like something that's oriented around justice and equality. But equity for the movement really means one thing: equity of outcome, that all outcomes should be equal, despite effort, despite merit, despite any other factor that might weigh in on disparate outcomes. And so if you see that there is an inequitable outcome, you can attribute it, according to the ideology, to only one thing: either racism or sexism or some other type of social oppression. And what this does is it really eliminates the possibility.
And I realized that I think my mic was muted. So I'm going to back up just a little bit and just say what I was saying.
Despite effort, despite merit, despite any other factor that might weigh in on disparate outcomes. And so if you see.
So when we know that to be true, and we see this in society, we see a movement to allow everyone to win. No one has too much. Nobody has too little. Everybody has about the same. Well, some of y'all have about the same, but it's still going to be, a hierarchy. Actually, she's going to mention that no matter what, there's always going to be a hierarchy of haves and have nots, or will always be that no matter what. But the thing that I think we're missing is that this is still man trying to play God, man trying to say what man can have, what man can achieve based upon our standards, not God's sovereignty. If God decided to bless someone with certain things and maybe another person without certain things, how dare we look at it and say, well, the person that has something is because of their race, their ethnicity, their gender, whatever, rather than, I mean, first of all, we shouldn't be worried about that. But rather than the fact that the other person over here maybe didn't work so hard, maybe didn't have the education, so on and so forth. Not everything, every inequity is due to some kind of nefarious means.
That there is an inequitable outcome, you can attribute it, according to the ideology, to only one thing, either racism or sexism or some other type of social oppression. And what this does is it really eliminates the possibility of any sort of measure, any sort of metric. So, for example, when you hear about the new woke math, and this is a real thing,
Woke
they'll
math,
say,
yep.
2 + 2 can equal 5 if it equals 5 in someone's lived experience. And I think it's easy for us to laugh at that because there's something on its face just so ridiculous about it. It seems like it can't be a serious proposition that someone is proposing. But there really is an ideological reason for that. That all standards have to be eradicated, even the ones that are undeniable as a simple mathematical equation that every person understands to be one thing. And the reason why is because we have to attribute all outcomes, all of our successes, all of our failures to systemic forces outside of ourselves. Our failures are not ours to own and learn from. Our successes are not ours to claim and grow with. And there's a truth to that, right? Because people do have disadvantages and
Yeah,
people
absolutely.
do have advantages over others. There's no state force that can equalize all those things. This is a human situation. And our success.
Let me jump in there real quick, because that's something we have to keep in mind. There's no way for humanly possible to make equal everyone. There's no way possible. Even in America, even in your state, even in your city, there's no way possible to make everyone equal. You can't. And that is why I believe we're still looking at an idea of Genesis, of a flavor, of variation of Genesis 3, because we still believe that we know what's good and what's bad. We know what's right, what's wrong, and we are like God.
Successes are not attributed, do not originate completely in us. Obviously, anything good that comes out of us is first and foremost attributed to God.
Right.
And it's just our cooperation with Him that brings any good in the world from us. So there's a truth that they're speaking to there. But what they do, rather than using it to point to the love of God and the power of God, rather it is only an indication of the evil of society. The fact that some people might merit something that others don't is attributed to the systemic forces, and the systemic forces have to be eradicated. Other people have spoken on this.
And again, it kind of goes back to what she said before. Those systemic forces are something in the past that we need to, those are the contradictions that we need to weed out of the mix, and it will keep moving forward in society. So now, 2 + 2 could equal 5, when before it would equal 4.
Particularly notably Jordan Peterson. All of humankind in any society is going to end up with some sort of hierarchical structure.
Right.
There's going to be, you see this in all of the, every Marxist country has ever tried to establish a society based on those principles ends up becoming tyrannical. And I think that that's inevitable based on the presuppositions. But if you're going to end up in some sort of hierarchical system, no matter what, the most fair way to establish that is through merit. I think that's easy to make merit into a cartoon where people say, oh, just pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, and without any recognition that people really do start life in situations where we need help. They're vulnerable, they're at risk. There are incredible hardships, and we can't just give them, a good pep talk and say, get on your way. We really need to have solidarity as Catholics. But the problem is, if you read any biography of any person who was born into incredibly difficult circumstances and somehow was able to transcend those circumstances, What was it? What was it that made the difference? It was someone in their life telling them to control what was within their control, to take responsibility, to not marinate in the injustices that they're born into, but rather to see what they can do that can pull themselves out. And you see this in, in the biography of Clarence Thomas, Ben Carson. His grandmother used to say, recite a poem to him called "Mr. Nobody," and it was something to along the lines of, when something's gone wrong and you've got no one to blame, who can you blame? Mr. Nobody. And the point of this lesson was just that, blame is going to get you nowhere, and you've been dealt a hard hand, but that mindset is going to actually exacerbate your circumstances.
Mhm.
And we would never tell someone that in any type of other situation. In leadership, if you're mentoring someone, if you're an uncle or you're an aunt, if you're a boss, you would never tell someone, point your finger at everyone else in the office and see how they're wrong. That person's the last person you want to promote. You want the person who's going to say, the buck stops with me. I'm going to take some initiative, and I'm going
That's
to
good.
grow, and I'm going to change. I'm going to see what I can do to make things better and be positive. But for some reason, we've decided that we can tell a whole generations of people that the way that they move through life is the exact opposite way in which is going to lead to their actual, flourishing in life.
So I think that was an excellent point, that we we don't see this played out anywhere else in society. Well, now you might actually, because we've embraced insanity, but we didn't see it in anywhere else in society before now. So that was just a good call out. Let's see where we go. How to talk to the woke.
Knowing how to engage with someone who is woke can be challenging, because in some ways the movement is not oriented around dialogue. Really, it's sort of oriented around intimidation. There's a lot of manipulation that happens with language, and I think it's important to know when it's not going to be a fruitful conversation, and you want to just say, I love you, let's not enter and let's not go down this road. So there's a certain amount of prudence that comes into the equation. Is this a person that I can actually have a dialogue with? And if it's not, then it can only create more division and more tension to try to do something that's really not a task that this combination of people are up for. But there will be other people, I think, who are, more open to having a real conversation, and with whom we might feel like this is something worthwhile to talk about. So I talk to parents a lot who are saying, my kids came home and they're woke now and they're challenging me. And I think it's important to know that this is in some ways a phase.
Mhm.
It could be just a phase. It could not be. It could be something that they really adopt lifelong. And I think that there are real woke ideologues out there who are, have fully embraced the movement. But there's also a lot of people who are just parroting a script that that's been handed to them, and it hasn't really penetrated into their soul. And I think that's when we have to realize that there is a deeper human longing that people have. And it's a longing that won't be satisfied by a thin ideology that has to be propped up by coercion, by silencing, by fear, and by manipulation. It's a longing that can only be fulfilled by the fullness of truth, a willingness to embrace the truth no matter where it leads you: scientific truth, philosophical truth, theological truth, and most of all, the truth of who we are in relationship to a loving God and loving Father. And I think that's what the human heart longs for. And it's something that cannot be fulfilled by ideology. And I think that we have to feel confidence in that every human person is longing for the exact same thing.
That was a great point. And now we're going to talk about, this is a very interesting segment.
And I think there's something really deeply spiritual happening there. Because when we think of authority now, right authority, or even fatherhood, the role of the father, our minds immediately go to tyrannical domination. It's been such an effective demonization of the image of a father. But if you talk to someone, they know what a good father should be.
Right.
They know, even if they didn't experience it. They know that a good father is not there to control them, but actually to empower them to lead their lives independently. They know a good father is gentle, but also strong. And I think we have so corrupted the image of the father in a way
Right.
to corrupt our understanding of who God is, because God is the father, and he's not a father because he's like a human father. Human fathers are more fatherly insofar as they're more like him. And that fatherhood really is a window into who God is. So the revolutionaries were, of course, correct. In targeting the father, you really dismantle society from the inside out. Because so they wrote about men needing to become licentious, right? To become slaves to their desires. That was part of our liberation. Our liberation.
Think about that. Like, wow, most revolutions were built off of men doing what God told them not to do. Isn't that crazy? But wait, it's going to actually get worse.
Is through combating groups outside of ourselves, but our liberation is also through combating our own internal desire to or instinct to repress our desires. And so part of our liberation was in embracing every desire, particularly ones that were transgressive. And this was a real target of men. And
so think about what she said earlier about faith and family. So how does this impact faith and family? Well, men no longer want to have families because they're able to get everything that they want from external sources and not in a committed relationship. And of course, now because of that, are they going to embrace the faith? Are they going to submit themselves to repressing transgressive behaviors? Absolutely.
And what happens then is once a man's moral authority is eroded, then women become vulnerable, because there is a way in which men are called to be providers and protectors. And once women become vulnerable, they tend to become calloused because the sexual revolution targeted them and it encouraged them to engage in all sorts of relationships and activities that women really have to callous themselves to engage in.
So just think about that. The hookup culture, the pro baby murder culture. How have women calloused themselves to embrace these ideas?
Because they have to develop a thick shell, I think. And I think that's hardened a lot of women. It's because they have felt truly used and have felt that they weren't cared for. And the deeper part of what's happening, I think, is that think about how the revolution manipulated this societal pathology. It encouraged men to become licentious, to become weak. And then it pointed to the abuse.
Notice she said men become licentious. It encouraged them to become weak. And I think that's a great point, that when we as men succumb to our carnal, sinful, base instincts, we're actually weak. We're not controlled. We're not self-controlled. We're not strong as we should be when we are embracing who God has told us to be.
Inevitable abuse and disruption that happened between men and women, and said, you see, this is further evidence that we need to smash the patriarchy. Men are bad, so let's condemn men as on a whole as being bad. It's suggesting that the cure is the exact thing that caused the problem. That furthering down on rejecting true masculinity is the way that we're going to get out of this hole of having eradicated what real masculinity is. St. Thomas Aquinas says that to be emasculated is to be a slave to pleasure, to the point where you're no longer willing to suffer. To be a real man, there is some connection between suffering and true masculinity that society needs.
Yeah, I mean, just think about our society today. How far would the idea that you should suffer as a man and put aside pleasures in order to care for your family, in order to provide for your loved ones and so forth, how far would that notion go? Not very far.
And families need.
Another commercial. They loaded a lot of commercials into this thing.
So I think we're going to have to fight this movement on multiple levels, and it's already happening far more than I think we realize. There are people building up new institutions. There are, more and more parents seeing through this, and we see in our school boards there's a resistance happening that's very grassroots and hopeful, I think. I think that people are starting to see through it, and there's a thinness to the ideology that is becoming transparent now. And people are seeing it affect their kids in such poor ways that it seems fundamentally like a justice movement that's actually more unjust than it is just.
Right.
But I think we have to fundamentally see this as a spiritual battle and fight it on that level, that this is a spiritual battle, that we have to be arming ourselves in that way for that fight. But the first thing I usually suggest to people is to just wrap your minds around it, understand what it is, get some clarity, because there's a shape shifting of how the movement presents itself, and there's a manipulation of language that happens that can be really confusing. And I think that the movement really tries to operate on that sort of confusion and capitalize on it and exploit it, with those good Christian precepts, and it's supplanting them with a bunch of ideology that you have to accept. So the more clarity that we have, then the more we will feel confident, I think, in resisting it and not falling for these types of tricks. But then fundamentally, I think we have to have courage. It's a movement that can't be resisted on the fringes. I think one person resisting or two people or a handful of people, that's a fringe movement. But galvanizing whole coalitions of people to resist it, that's something to contend with. And I think that's the way we fight it within companies and within counties and even within our country as a whole. That type of clarity can imbue us with a sort of courage that can really give us what we need, the confidence to simply and plainly call out a lie. And the greatest threat to a lie is someone simply and plainly saying the truth. I think it feels like it's Goliath at the moment, but Goliath can be brought to his knees far more easily than we think. And so I think that can give us a lot of hope in this fight.
I appreciate that. That was a fun video, and I thought she did an excellent job of pointing out some basic understandings of woke ideology. Now, granted, I've heard these same things from Dr. Bauckham, and tons of other people as well. I just thought that her answers were pretty straight and to the point and made a nice, short, concise video. But feel free to let me know what you thought about it. Feel free to comment down below. Give me some ideas if you want me to check out other videos or whatnot, or if you think maybe I missed something even in this video. I would love to hear your thoughts and your 2 cents, because we all are trying to get better and learn more. So let's pray and let's get up out of here. Father, I thank you today that we have a chance to just discover and to understand new ideas that are coming up against the church. I pray, God, that you'll give us the wisdom and the boldness and the courage to stand up against these things and anything else with the word of God, which you've given us to fight against this type of activity. So we thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen. Everybody, again, thank you so much for your support of DearWokeChristian.com. I sincerely appreciate you. Thank you for those ones that have supported me on Buy Me a Cup of Coffee. You all are excellent as well. And everybody that's watched this video, liked, shared, and subscribed, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. And again, everybody, until next time, grace and peace.